Tony Bennett stood under the small plexiglass shelter at the corner of 72nd and Broadway, watching the October rain create rivers along the Manhattan sidewalk. At 97, he had learned to carry an umbrella religiously, but today's sudden downpour had caught even the weather forecasters off guard. The afternoon sun had given way to dark clouds so quickly that most pedestrians found themselves unprepared for the deluge. He had been walking home from his monthly checkup with Dr. Morrison when the sky opened up, forcing him to seek shelter at the nearest bus stop. The irony wasn't lost on him. He hadn't ridden public transportation in decades, yet here he was, waiting under a bus shelter like any other New Yorker caught in an unexpected storm. "Excuse me," came a voice beside him. "Would it be too much trouble to share your umbrella space?" Tony looked to his right and saw an elderly woman, probably in her 80s, standing just outside the shelter's protection. She was impeccably dressed in a navy wool coat and sensible shoes, but her white hair was already damp from the rain, and she clutched a small purse tightly against her chest. "Of course," Tony said immediately, stepping to one side and extending his large black umbrella to cover them both. "Please, come in from the rain." "Thank you so much," she said, moving gratefully under the umbrella's protection. "I'm Eleanor Walsh. This weather caught me completely by surprise." "Tony Bennett," he replied, then immediately wondered if he should have used his real name, Anthony Benedetto. But Eleanor showed no sign of recognition, which was actually refreshing. "Are you waiting for the bus as well, Mr. Bennett?" "Actually, no. I was just seeking shelter from the rain. I live a few blocks from here." "Oh, how lovely. I'm visiting my granddaughter who lives on 75th Street. I don't get into the city very often anymore. I live in New Jersey, but today was her birthday." Tony studied Eleanor's face and noticed she looked slightly distressed, beyond what the unexpected rain would explain. "Is everything all right? You seem a bit worried." Eleanor hesitated, as if debating whether to confide in a stranger. "To be honest, I'm a bit embarrassed. I seem to have gotten myself turned around. I've been walking for 20 minutes, and I'm not entirely sure where I am. Would you like me to help you find your granddaughter's building?" "That's very kind, but I don't want to impose. You probably have somewhere important to be." Tony smiled at the assumption. At his age, very few places felt truly urgent anymore. "Mrs. Walsh, I assure you I have nowhere more important to be than helping a fellow New Yorker find her way." "What's the address you're looking for?" Eleanor reached into her purse and pulled out a small piece of paper with an address written in careful handwriting. 315 West 75th Street. My granddaughter Jessica lives there with her husband." Tony looked at the address and realized they were only about 4 blocks away, but in the rain and with Eleanor's apparent confusion, it might as well have been 4 miles. "That's very close," he said reassuringly. "When the rain lets up a bit, I'd be happy to walk you there." "You're very kind, Mr. Bennett. I hope I'm not keeping you from something important." "Not at all. In fact, I was hoping the rain would give me an excuse to slow down. I tend to walk too quickly these days, as if I'm trying to outrun my age." Eleanor laughed, and Tony noticed how her whole demeanor lightened. "I know exactly what you mean. Sometimes I catch myself rushing as if I still have somewhere urgent to be, when the truth is most of my urgent days are behind me." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the rain bounce off the pavement and listening to the steady drumming on the shelter roof. "Mr. Bennett, may I ask what you do? You have the bearing of someone who's used to being listened to." Tony considered his answer. "I'm retired now, but I was a performer. Music, mostly." "How wonderful. What kind of music?" "The standards, jazz, songs people used to dance to. Nothing too modern, I'm afraid." Eleanor's eyes lit up with genuine interest. "Oh, I love that kind of music. My late husband Frank and I used to go dancing every Saturday night for 43 years. We had our favorite songs, our special ones that would make us both stop whatever we were doing and just listen. What were your favorites? The Way You Look Tonight was our wedding song, and I Left My Heart in San Francisco. Frank always said that song made him think of the honeymoon we took in California in 1962. Tony felt a familiar warmth hearing his songs mentioned with such affection, but he resisted the urge to reveal his connection to them. This conversation was more honest because Eleanor didn't know who he was. "Those are beautiful songs," he said simply. "Your husband sounds like a man with good taste." He was. Frank passed away 3 years ago, and I still find myself humming those songs when I'm feeling lonely. Music has a way of keeping people with us, doesn't it? It does. Music might be the closest thing we have to time travel. Eleanor looked at him with surprise at the observation. That's exactly right. When I hear "The Way You Look Tonight," I'm not an 83-year-old widow in a bus shelter. I'm 22 years old, dancing with my husband at our wedding reception. Do you still dance? Oh, heavens, no. Who would I dance with? And besides, my arthritis makes it difficult to move the way I used to. But you could still dance if you wanted to. Dancing doesn't require a partner or perfect mobility. Sometimes dancing is just letting the music move through you, even if you're sitting still. Eleanor studied Tony's face with new interest. You speak about music like someone who truly understands it. Were you a professional musician? For a while, yes. What instrument did you play? Actually, I was a singer. A singer? How wonderful. I always admired singers. It takes such courage to use your voice as your instrument. The rain began to lighten slightly, and Tony could see that their window for walking to Eleanor's destination was opening. "Mrs. Walsh, would you like to start making our way to your granddaughter's building? We can take our time, and if the rain picks up again, there are plenty of places to duck inside." "That would be lovely, thank you." As they began walking, sharing Tony's umbrella, Eleanor continued their conversation about music. "Mr. Bennett, may I ask about your singing career? Did you perform locally, or did you travel?" "I travelled quite a bit. Got to see the country, meet people from all walks of life. It was a privilege, really." "Did you ever record anything? I mean, were you on records that people could buy?" Tony smiled at her careful way of asking if he'd been successful. "A few records, yes. Nothing that would have made me rich or famous, but enough to make a living doing what I loved." "That sounds like the perfect career. So many people work their whole lives doing things that don't fulfill them. You were lucky to find something you were passionate about." "I was very lucky," Tony agreed. "Though I didn't always appreciate how lucky at the time." They walked slowly, partly because of Eleanor's pace and partly because Tony was enjoying their conversation. As they passed other pedestrians hurrying through the rain, he noticed how Eleanor observed each person with kindness and curiosity. "Mrs. Walsh, tell me about your granddaughter. What's the occasion for today's birthday visit?" Eleanor's face brightened immediately. "Jessica is turning 30 today, and she just finished her residency in pediatrics. She's starting her first position as a real doctor next month." "That's wonderful. You must be very proud." "I am, but I'm also worried about her. She works such long hours and she doesn't seem to have time for relationships or friends or any of the things that make life enjoyable." "Sounds like she's very dedicated to her work." "Too dedicated, maybe. She reminds me of myself when I was her age, so focused on proving myself that I forgot to actually live." Tony glanced at Eleanor, hearing something in her tone that suggested a story. "What did you do for work?" "I was a nurse for 45 years. Started when women in medicine were rare, worked my way up to head of surgical nursing at Mount Sinai. I was proud of what I accomplished, but I sometimes wonder if I sacrificed too much personal happiness for professional success." "What kind of sacrifices?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment as they navigated around a large puddle. Frank and I wanted children, but I kept postponing it because I was always in the middle of some important project at the hospital. By the time I felt ready to start a family, we discovered I couldn't get pregnant. Tony felt the weight of her regret. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Walsh." "Thank you. We considered adoption, but Frank was diagnosed with heart problems around the same time, and we decided we needed to focus on his health instead of bringing a child into an uncertain situation." "But you have Jessica." Jessica is Frank's brother's granddaughter. When her parents were killed in a car accident when she was 16, Frank and I became her guardians. She lived with us through high school and college, and she's been like our own daughter ever since. "So you did get to be a parent in a way." "We did, and Jessica saved our lives, gave us purpose when Frank's health was declining, gave us someone to love and worry about and be proud of." They had reached the corner of 75th Street, and Tony could see building number 315 just ahead. "Mrs. Walsh, I think we've found your destination." Eleanor looked up at the building with relief and gratitude. "Mr. Bennett, I can't thank you enough. Not just for the directions, but for the company. I was feeling quite lonely and lost when you found me, and this conversation has been exactly what I needed." "The feeling is mutual," Tony said honestly. "Sometimes the best part of a rainy day is the unexpected conversation it provides." Eleanor reached into her purse and pulled out a small wrapped gift. "This is for Jessica, a necklace that belonged to my mother. But walking with you today reminded me that the most valuable gifts are often the stories we share and the connections we make with other people." "That's a beautiful sentiment." "Mr. Bennett, may I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "Do you have regrets about your music career? Things you wish you had done differently?" Tony considered the question carefully. "I regret the time I spent away from family and friends while I was touring and recording. I regret not appreciating some of the opportunities I had while I was having them. But I don't regret the music itself, or the chance to bring joy to people through songs. That's wise. Frank always told me that the only regrets worth having are the ones that teach us to do better next time." Eleanor looked up at Jessica's building, then back at Tony. "Would you like to meet Jessica? I'm sure she'd enjoy meeting a real musician." Tony was tempted, but he sensed that this conversation had been perfect, precisely because it had remained between two strangers, sharing honest thoughts without the complications of fame or recognition. "That's very kind, but I should head home before the rain starts up again. Give Jessica my best wishes for her birthday and tell her how proud her grandmother is of her." "I will. And Mr. Bennett, I hope you know that your music, whatever songs you recorded, brought joy to people even if you never met them. Music like that doesn't disappear. It becomes part of people's lives forever." Tony felt deeply moved by Eleanor's words, understanding that she was offering him something precious without even realizing it. Confirmation that his life's work had mattered to people he would never know. "Thank you, Mrs. Walsh. That means more than you could possibly know." They shook hands formally, and Tony watched as Eleanor walked into the building lobby, where she was immediately greeted by a young woman who must have been Jessica. Through the glass doors, Tony could see the joyful reunion between grandmother and granddaughter, and he felt grateful to have played a small part in bringing them together on this rainy afternoon. As Tony walked the remaining blocks to his apartment, he reflected on Eleanor's story and her observations about regret and purpose. Her words about music becoming part of people's lives forever resonated deeply with him, reminding him that the impact of his career extended far beyond concert halls and recording studios. He thought about Eleanor and Frank dancing to "The Way You Look Tonight" for 43 years, about how "I Left My Heart in San Francisco" had become the soundtrack to their honeymoon memories. These were the moments that made all the years of touring and recording worthwhile, not the reviews or awards, but the simple fact that his songs had provided the soundtrack for other people's love stories. When Tony reached his apartment, he was surprised to find that his clothes were barely damp despite the walk in the rain. Eleanor's company had made the journey feel both longer and shorter than it actually was. Longer because their conversation had been so rich, shorter because the time had passed so quickly. That evening, as Tony sat at his piano, he found himself playing The Way You Look Tonight and thinking about Eleanor and Frank's 43 years of Saturday night dancing. He played it the way he imagined they had danced to it, not as a performance, but as a celebration of enduring love and the simple pleasure of moving together to music. The next morning, Tony woke to find the sun shining brightly, as if the previous day's storm had never happened. But he carried with him the memory of his conversation with Eleanor, and the reminder that sometimes the most meaningful encounters happen not when we're seeking them, but when we're simply willing to share an umbrella with a stranger caught in the rain. 2 weeks later, Tony received a thank you note in the mail. The return address showed no name, but when he opened it, he found Eleanor's careful handwriting. Dear Mr. Bennett, I wanted to thank you again for your kindness during our rainy walk to Jessica's building. I told her about our conversation and she was fascinated to hear about your music career. She asked me to tell you that she's been listening to jazz and standards while she studies, and that the music helps her feel less stressed during her long shifts at the hospital. I also wanted to share something that happened after we said goodbye. When I gave Jessica her birthday gift, my mother's necklace, I also told her the story of our conversation about music, time travel, and the importance of not sacrificing all personal happiness for professional success. Jessica confided that she'd been feeling overwhelmed by her work schedule and worried that she was missing out on life outside the hospital. Our conversation, which I shared with her, inspired her to join a salsa dancing class that starts next week. She says she wants to create the kind of memories that music can bring back, just like Frank and I did. Thank you for reminding an old woman that unexpected conversations with kind strangers can be just as valuable as any planned destination. I hope you're staying dry and that your music continues to bring joy to people's lives. With gratitude, Eleanor Walsh, P.S. Jessica asked me to tell you that if you ever decide to perform again, you have 2 devoted fans who would love to attend. Tony smiled as he read Eleanor's note, understanding that their brief encounter had created exactly the kind of ripple effect that made life meaningful. Eleanor had found her way to Jessica's birthday celebration. Jessica had been inspired to embrace music and dancing, and Tony had been reminded that his greatest performances often happened not on stage, but in quiet moments of human connection. The bus stop encounter had taught him something important about the nature of influence and legacy. Sometimes the most significant impact we have on other people's lives comes not from grand gestures or public achievements, but from simple acts of kindness offered to strangers who need exactly what we have to give at exactly the moment we're able to give it. Tony kept Eleanor's note on his piano, where it served as a daily reminder that music's greatest power lay not in its ability to entertain, but in its capacity to connect people across time and circumstance, creating soundtracks for love stories that would play on long after the musicians themselves had taken their final bows. And sometimes, on rainy afternoons when he heard the sound of drops against his windows, Tony would think about Eleanor and Jessica, and hope that they were still dancing to the songs that had become part of their family's story. Just as his music had become part of countless other families' stories through decades of shared listening, dancing, and love. But the story of Eleanor and Tony's encounter didn't end with her thank you note. 6 months later, Tony found himself back at the same bus stop, sheltering from another sudden shower. "Mr. Bennett, is that really you?" Tony turned to see Eleanor approaching with a young woman in scrubs, Jessica. "Mrs. Walsh, what a pleasant surprise. And you must be Jessica." Jessica smiled warmly. "I've been hoping to meet you since Grandma told me about your conversation. I'm Jessica Rodriguez now. I got married 3 months ago." Tony felt a surge of joy. "Congratulations," Eleanor explained. "Jessica met Miguel at those salsa dancing classes I mentioned. Your advice about not sacrificing personal happiness really took hold." Jessica beamed. "We had our first dance to The Way You Look Tonight, the same song Grandma and Grandpa Frank danced to." Eleanor nodded. "And Mr. Bennett, our conversation changed my life too. I joined a seniors choir at the community centre. I'm even doing solos now." Tony felt moved by the ripple effects. "That's wonderful news," Jessica added. "And I started a volunteer choir program at my hospital. Grandma Eleanor has become one of our most popular volunteers, singing for patients who don't have family." Tony was amazed. "You've created exactly the kind of community music is meant to foster." Eleanor looked thoughtful. "Would you consider visiting our choir rehearsal sometime? Our director would be thrilled to meet you." "I'd be delighted. When do you rehearse?" "Thursday evenings at 7 at the Riverside Community Centre." "I'll be there this Thursday." Eleanor clapped her hands together in excitement. "Oh, this is wonderful. Wait until I tell Maria. She's going to faint." "Please don't let her faint. I'm much better with singers who remain conscious." Eleanor laughed, and Tony was struck by how different her laugh sounded now. Fuller, more confident, more joyful than it had been during their first meeting. "Mr. Bennett, may I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "Do you ever feel like your life has had the impact you hoped it would have?" Tony considered the question carefully. "Mrs. Walsh, 6 months ago, I would have said that my biggest impact came from my recordings and concerts. But meeting you has taught me that the most important impact might be the conversations and connections that happen one person at a time, often when we least expect them." "I feel the same way. Frank used to say that we never know which moment is going to change everything, so we should treat every moment as if it might be the important one." Frank was clearly a philosopher as well as a dance partner. Eleanor smiled at the memory. He was. He also would have loved this, his wife and granddaughter carrying on his love of music with help from a kind stranger who shared his umbrella on a rainy day. As they prepared to part ways again, Eleanor reached into her purse and pulled out a small photograph. "This is Frank and me at our 40th wedding anniversary," she said, handing Tony the picture. "I wanted you to see the face of the man who fell in love with your music." Tony looked at the photograph and saw a couple in their 70s, clearly still deeply in love, dancing together at what appeared to be a family celebration. Frank's face showed the kind of contentment that comes from a life well lived, and Eleanor looked radiant in his arms. "They look like they're still hearing the music," Tony said softly. "They were. That photo was taken while the band was playing The Way You Look Tonight. Frank always said that song made him see me the way I looked on our wedding day, no matter how old we got." Tony handed the photo back to Eleanor, but she shook her head. "Keep it," she said. "I want you to know that your music didn't just entertain people. It helped them love each other better. That's worth remembering." As Tony walked home that day carrying Frank and Eleanor's anniversary photo in his jacket pocket, he reflected on the unexpected gift of their second encounter. Eleanor's transformation from a lost, lonely widow to a vibrant woman discovering new aspects of herself had shown him something important about resilience and reinvention. Her success in the choir, Jessica's marriage, and volunteer work, and the ripple effects that continued to spread through their family and community, proved that small acts of kindness could generate changes that lasted far longer than anyone could predict. Thursday evening arrived, and Tony made his way to the Riverside Community Centre. The rehearsal room was filled with about 20 people, mostly in their 60s and 70s, warming up their voices. When Eleanor saw Tony enter, she rushed over to greet him. "Everyone," she called out, "I'd like you to meet the special guest I've been telling you about." Tony was introduced to Maria Santos, the choir director, a former music teacher with boundless energy. "Mr. Bennett," Maria said, "Eleanor has told us about your conversation and how it inspired her to join our group. We're honored to have you here." The rehearsal that followed was unlike anything Tony had experienced in his professional career. The choir members sang with varying technical skill, but their enthusiasm and joy were infectious. When they rehearsed "The Way You Look Tonight," Tony was moved to hear Eleanor's solo. Her voice wasn't technically perfect, but it carried the wisdom and emotion of someone who truly understood the song's meaning. "Eleanor," Tony said when the song ended, "that was beautiful. You sing that song like someone who has lived its words." After rehearsal, Maria approached Tony. "Mr. Bennett, would you consider singing something with our group?" Tony moved to the piano and began "Fly Me to the Moon." As he sang, the choir members joined in with improvised harmonies. The result was imperfect, but magical. When the song ended, the room filled with applause. Tony felt more satisfied than after many professional performances. "Thank you," he told the group. "That reminded me why I fell in love with music in the first place." Eleanor approached him as the others packed up. "Mr. Bennett, I can't thank you enough for coming tonight. Mrs. Walsh, you've reminded me that music's greatest power isn't in impressing people, it's in connecting them." As Tony walked home that evening, he carried with him the sound of Eleanor's voice singing "The Way You Look Tonight," and the image of Frank and Eleanor dancing at their anniversary celebration. The bus stop encounter had grown into something much larger than either of them could have imagined, proving that sometimes the most important journeys begin not with a destination in mind, but with a willingness to share an umbrella with a stranger in the rain. Over the following months, Tony became a regular at the choir rehearsals. What had started as a single visit had evolved into something meaningful for both him and the group. Eleanor's confidence continued to grow with each performance. Her solo of "The Way You Look Tonight" became a signature piece that audiences requested at every concert. Jessica's volunteer choir program expanded to serve 3 different medical facilities. Miguel incorporated many of Tony's songs into his music therapy sessions, finding that patients with Alzheimer's often responded to the familiar melodies. The ripple effects continued to spread. Eleanor began teaching informal singing lessons to other widows, sharing not just vocal techniques, but the emotional healing that music brought to grief. On the anniversary of their meeting, Tony received another note from Eleanor. "Dear Tony, it's been exactly 1 year since you shared your umbrella with a lost old woman. This has been the most meaningful year of my life since Frank passed away. Thank you for reminding an old woman that her story wasn't over. Because of your kindness, I've discovered that some of life's most beautiful chapters are written in the margins, in unexpected encounters and second chances. Your friend always, Eleanor." Tony smiled as he read Eleanor's note, understanding that their chance meeting had created exactly the kind of legacy he hoped for. Not fame or recognition, but human connections that continued to generate love, purpose, and joy long after the initial encounter had ended. The benefit concerts became an annual tradition, with Tony serving as both guest performer and proud supporter of the community that had grown from a simple act of sharing an umbrella on a rainy Manhattan afternoon.